Hi and welcome to this new section where you learn about object-oriented programming, often referred to as OOP for short. Now, if you have experience with programming, that's probably a familiar concept for you because OOP is used in most of the languages. But I assume you don't know anything about object-oriented programming, so I'll explain the concept from the beginning. Now, there are various definitions of OOP out there, and some get very tricky. But I believe the best one to know is that object-oriented programming is just a way to organize your code. That means OOP is not a must. So you can simply use functions to build an application as we did here with our bookstore application. And many programmers choose to not use object-oriented programming to organize their code, so they don't use the OOP way to write their code, in other words. However, it is generally accepted that if you have more than two functions, which apply operations to the same object, for instance, a program that applies operations to a Tkinter interface, so you have these callback functions. So you should organize these functions into something called a class. Now, because object-oriented programming is a complex concept, I didn't include that in the beginning of this course. So I wanted that you first build some applications using functions, which is more intuitive, and then you move to object-oriented programming. So back to our graphical user interface application. So the object here, I'm talking about objects, and the object here is the entire window with buttons and other widgets as well. Now we can put all the attributes that define this object, so this window, such as the title, the buttons, the labels, and also the callback functions attached to this object inside a class. So in our application we didn't use classes, we used functions. So this script here does not apply to object-oriented programming. And putting this object inside a class means we're organizing the code in a class, which creates an object, so that's why we call it object-oriented programming. And using classes to organize your code is referred to as object-oriented programming. And what I'll do next is, in my backend script where I have the database operations, I'll transform this script by putting this inside a class. And after that you can do the same for the front-end interface so that you practice object-oriented programming. Now, my purpose here is not to train you how to write classes. I first want you to understand classes, and many learning resources explain object-oriented programming by saying something like, we create a class that creates a dog object, and the dog can eat and bark and so on. Now, that's a good example to train you to learn the syntax of a class, but hey, what is a dog in programming? I mean, you can scratch your head the whole day trying to come up with a scenario where you'd have a dog as an object in your application. So that's still a good example, but only if you have some years of experience in programming and you can quickly think of where and when to use classes based on such examples. I assume you don't have these years of experience, so I'll use real programming objects in this section to explain such a tricky concept as object-oriented programming. So the best way to understand OOP is to first build a program with the known object-oriented programming approach, so using functions. And once you know that program well, then you build that program again using OOP, and then you automatically understand what OOP is by looking at how things are different. So let me organize this code using classes now, and later we'll build a simpler program from scratch where we create a bank account object with Python, and we will apply functions to that object such as withdraw, deposit, and so on. That's great, and yep, that's about this introduction, and let's move on to the next lecture and write some classes.